The three small Kethvori children pressed themselves against the ventilation grate, their silver eyes unblinking as they watched the human in the adjacent habitat pod prepare his evening meal. Their mother had told them never to look, never to acknowledge the creature beyond the wall, but hunger and curiosity were stronger than obedience. The oldest, no taller than a human 5-year-old despite being nearly 8 solar cycles, traced one clawed finger along the metal slats. Through the grate, warm light spilled into their darkened compartment, carrying with it the scent of something they had never encountered before, something that made their stomachs ache with longing. The human hummed as he worked, completely unaware that he was being observed, completely unaware that his simple routine was about to shatter the careful isolation of a family that had spent 2 years hiding in the shadows of Zirion Station. The station itself hung in the dead space between inhabited sectors, a forgotten waypoint where those who didn't want to be found could disappear. Vera had chosen this place precisely because humans rarely ventured here. The few who did were running from something too, which meant they asked no questions. She had calculated every risk, every variable, every possible exposure point. She had not calculated for kindness. Now, watching through the crack in their sleeping chamber door, as her children defied her explicit orders, Vera felt the old terror rise in her chest. The Kethvori didn't make friends with humans. The Kethvori didn't make friends with anyone, not since the Purge had scattered her people across 100 systems, hunted and harvested for the neural pathways that made them such efficient navigators. Her children didn't know their gift yet, didn't know that their developing minds would one day be worth more than entire cargo ships to the right buyer. They only knew they were hungry, and the human next door always seemed to have food. Vera's species had evolved on a world of scarce resources and sudden violence. Trust was a genetic impossibility, coded into every instinct, reinforced by 1,000 generations of necessary paranoia. She had survived the loss of her mate, the destruction of her clanship, and 3 close calls with slavers by trusting absolutely no one. Her children would learn this lesson, or they would not survive. There was no middle ground. Yet there they were, 3 silver-eyed witnesses to her failure, watching the human called Ryan slice something orange and fragrant with obvious pleasure. The knife caught the light as Ryan worked through the small pile of carrots he'd traded a week's worth of recycling credits to obtain. Fresh vegetables were absurdly expensive this far from the agricultural zones, but he'd learned during his years of exile that small comforts mattered more than grand gestures. The carrots reminded him of Earth, of a garden he'd once tended, of a life before his testimony had made him a pariah among his own kind. Whistleblowers were protected by law, but not by community. He'd told the truth about the corporate mining operation that had poisoned an entire colony's water supply, and he'd been rewarded with survival and total isolation. Which was fine. He preferred it that way. He'd noticed the Kethvori family moving into the adjacent pod 2 years ago, seen the mother's stiff posture, and the way she positioned herself between her children and every doorway, every corridor, every possible threat. He recognized a fellow exile when he saw one. So he'd done what any decent neighbor would do. He'd left them completely alone. But he'd also made sure to cook his meals at the same time each evening, right next to the shared ventilation system. If the smell of real food drifted into their quarters, well, that was just poor station design. If he occasionally left sealed containers of non-perishable items outside his door, only to find them gone by morning, that was probably the station's automated cleaning system. He told himself these small fictions and slept better for them. Tonight, as he arranged the carrots in a simple pattern on his plate, a habit from childhood he'd never quite broken, he heard it. A sound so soft he almost missed it beneath the station's ambient hum. A child's laugh. Ryan's hand froze mid-reach. In 2 years, he had never heard a sound from the adjacent pod beyond the occasional footstep or the whisper of their door mechanism. The Kethvori mother ran her household like a military operation, silent and efficient. But that laugh had been pure and unguarded, the universal music of a child delighted by something small. He set down his fork and listened. Another giggle, quickly hushed. Then a rapid chittering he recognized as Kethvori parental scolding, though he didn't speak the language. He imagined the scene on the other side of the wall, a mother trying to maintain discipline, children testing boundaries the way all children did, regardless of species. On impulse, Ryan picked up 3 of his precious carrots and walked to his door. The corridor was empty, as always. His pod and the Kethvori families shared a service junction that saw almost no foot traffic. He placed the carrots in a neat row outside their door, each one perpendicular to the others the way he'd arranged them on his plate. Something about the geometry felt important, though he couldn't say why. He retreated to his pod and waited. 5 minutes passed. 10. He was about to give up and return to his cooling meal when he heard the hiss of their door opening. Footsteps, lighter than the mother's heavy, cautious tread. Then silence. Then more chittering, this time excited rather than scolding. Ryan smiled despite himself. The next morning, he found something outside his door, a small piece of metal, no bigger than his thumb, worked into an intricate knot pattern that seemed to fold through impossible dimensions. Kethvori craftwork. He'd seen similar pieces for sale in the station's gray market, priced far beyond his means. He picked it up carefully, turning it in the light. The metal was warm, and as he watched, the pattern seemed to shift, revealing new depths he hadn't noticed at first glance. Someone had spent hours making this. He attached it to the chain he wore around his neck, where it settled against his chest like a small, warm secret. The carrots became a ritual. 3 times a week, whatever he could spare, a piece of fruit, a protein bar, once an entire sandwich he'd assembled and then realized he wasn't actually hungry enough to eat. He always arranged them in geometric patterns, varying the designs but maintaining the precision. The return gifts accumulated on his shelf, 7 pieces of worked metal now, each more intricate than the last, each singing with hours of focused attention. They never spoke. They never met. It was perfect. Until the day Vera's past caught up with her. Ryan heard the commotion from 3 corridors away, the heavy footfalls of multiple people moving with purpose, the electronic crackle of weapons being powered up, the sharp commands in galactic standard that meant official business and probable violence. He'd learned to recognize the sound of trouble during his months testifying against Helix Corporation, when hired thugs had made several attempts to permanently silence his cooperation. He moved to his door's security feed and felt his stomach drop. 4 armored figures were taking positions outside the Kethvori pod. Not station security. Their gear was too expensive, too specialized. Private contractors, which meant someone had paid significant credits to find Vera and her children. Through his audio pickup, he heard the lead contractor's amplified voice. Kethvori subject Vera of Clan Murthak, you are in violation of Indenture Contract 447-B. Your children are designated property of the Navart Corporation, genetic rights established by your deceased mate's service agreement. Exit the habitat immediately, or we will extract you by force. Ryan's mind raced. Indenture contracts were legal in some sectors, horrifyingly common in the corporate territories. If Vera's mate had signed away genetic rights to their children, or if the contract claimed he had, then by the letter of certain laws, those children were considered corporate assets. The Kethvori's gifts as navigators made them incredibly valuable. Young Kethvori, whose abilities were still developing and could be shaped through training and conditioning, were worth even more. This wasn't a custody dispute. This was a harvest. He watched through the feed as Vera appeared in her doorway, positioning herself to block any view of the interior. Her stance was rigid, her head held high despite the 4 weapons pointed at her center mass. She spoke in Kethvori, rapid and harsh, and Ryan's translation implant struggled to keep pace. My mate's contract was fulfilled by his death in your service. My children are not property. Leave, or I will ensure you regret the attempt. The lead contractor laughed. A single Kethvori civilian against 4 armed professionals? The math doesn't favor you. Ryan's hand moved to the comm panel before his conscious mind had fully decided. He opened a priority channel to station administration, a channel that had been given to him after his testimony, a direct line he'd been assured would always be answered, would always grant him protection if he needed it. The line rang twice before a bored voice answered. Protected Witness Hotline. This is Ryan Callahan, ID number 7743 Alpha. I need immediate assistance. Armed contractors are attempting an illegal extraction in my residential section. Contractors operating under valid indenture contracts are not subject to station interference, Mr. Callahan. This doesn't fall under witness protection protocols. They're threatening children. Ryan's voice came out harder than he'd intended. And they're doing it 15 meters from a protected witness, which means they've conducted surveillance in a restricted zone. That's a protocol violation. A pause. Then, stand by. Through the security feed, Ryan saw the lead contractor raise his weapon toward Vera. Time crystallized into something sharp and breakable. He grabbed the heaviest wrench from his maintenance kit and stepped into the corridor. 4 helmeted heads turned toward him with mechanical precision. Gentlemen, Ryan said, his voice remarkably steady given that his heart was trying to escape through his ribs. I believe you're violating about 6 different station regulations, starting with unauthorized weapons deployment in a residential zone. The lead contractor's stance shifted slightly, readjusting to account for a new variable. This doesn't concern you, human. Return to your habitat. Actually, it concerns me quite a bit. Ryan took 3 steps forward, closing the distance, making himself a factor they couldn't ignore. See, I've been documenting your operation since you arrived. Facial recognition, weapon signatures, communications intercepts, all automatically uploaded to station security and, more importantly, to the Galactic Trade Commission. He was making up about 70% of this, but he'd learned during his testimony that confidence mattered more than truth when dealing with corporate muscle. The GTC takes a very dim view of child trafficking, even when it's dressed up as contract enforcement. We have legal documentation, which I'm sure is absolutely legitimate and not at all fabricated by a corporation with a history of ethics violations. Ryan let that hang in the air. Tell me, does Navar Corporation know you're using the same extraction team that was flagged by the GTC last year for the Safara incident? Because my understanding is that any team member involved in that clusterfuck was supposed to be permanently barred from child-related indenture enforcement. He had no idea if any of this was true. He was gambling that corporations like Navark cut corners, that teams like this one had histories they'd rather not have examined. The contractor's weapon lowered slightly. Ryan pressed his advantage. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave. You're going to report to your employer that the targets could not be located. And in return, I won't send my documentation to the 7 different regulatory agencies that would love to make an example out of Navark's enforcement division. Or, the contractor said, his weapon rising again, we complete our contract and eliminate the witness. Ryan felt sweat trail down his spine. He'd overplayed his hand. These weren't corporate security concerned about bad publicity. These were contractors who'd probably done worse than murder for the right price. Then Vera spoke, still in Kethvori, and Ryan's implant translated. The human speaks truth. Station security approaches. Your window closes. The lead contractor cocked his head, listening to something on his private comm. His posture shifted from aggressive to calculating. This isn't finished, he said, but he was already backing away, his team moving with him. The contract stands. We'll be back with proper authorization. They disappeared around the corner with practiced efficiency, leaving Ryan alone in the corridor with a wrench he hadn't realized he was clutching hard enough to make his knuckles ache. Vera stared at him from her doorway, her silver eyes unreadable. Why? She asked in heavily accented standard. Her voice was rough, unused to the human language. Why risk yourself for strangers? Ryan opened his mouth, then closed it. The honest answer was complicated, wrapped up in guilt and loneliness and a desperate need to matter to someone, even if that someone was a neighbor he'd never actually met. Instead, he said, the carrots seemed to be a hit. Behind Vera, 3 small faces appeared, peering around their mother's legs with those enormous silver eyes. The oldest one held a half-eaten carrot in one clawed hand. The child spoke in Kethvori, rapid and insistent. Vera's expression shifted through several emotions Ryan couldn't quite read. Surprise, confusion, and something that might have been grief. What did they say? Ryan asked. Vera was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully neutral. They say you are their father now, that you provide food, you protect the nest, you give gifts of beauty. She gestured at the metalwork Ryan wore around his neck. In Kethvori culture, these are the defining actions of parenthood. Biology is less important than behavior. Ryan felt something expand in his chest, warm and terrifying. I can't. I know what you are, Vera interrupted. I know you are alone, exiled from your people for speaking truth when silence would have been safer. I know you have chosen isolation rather than compromise. She paused, and her next words came slowly, as if each one cost her something precious. I know these things because I am the same. The smallest child, a girl, Ryan realized, though he wasn't sure how he knew, reached out one small hand toward him. Her claws were undeveloped, blunt, and harmless. My mate, Vera said quietly, died believing he had protected us by signing a contract he did not understand. The corporation that owned his labor claimed his death voided nothing, that our children were always meant to be payment for his training. I have run for 3 years. I have trusted no one. Her voice cracked slightly. I did not know trust was still possible until you placed carrots and patterns outside my door and asked nothing in return. Ryan's throat felt tight. The contractors will come back. Yes. We need to leave the station, find somewhere more remote. We? Vera's head tilted slightly, a Kethvori expression of confusion. I know a place, Ryan said, the plan forming even as he spoke. A failed colony on the edge of the outer drift. No corporations, no authorities, just a few hundred people who want to be left alone. It's not much, but it is a nest, Vera finished. A place to raise children safely. The oldest child spoke again, still clutching that carrot, and Vera translated without being asked. He wants to know if you will teach him to make food smell beautiful like you do. Ryan laughed, surprising himself with the sound. Yeah, I can do that. Vera stepped back from the doorway, a gesture of invitation that Ryan recognized as monumental for someone who had spent years trusting no one. He crossed the threshold into their habitat, and the children swarmed him immediately, chittering in excitement, their small hands exploring his clothes and hair with fearless curiosity. The middle child, a boy with silver eyes slightly darker than his siblings, held up one of the metal pieces Ryan had been given, pointing at it and then at the pendant around Ryan's neck. He spoke in halting standard. You keep gifts. You are family. Ryan knelt down, bringing himself to eye level with the three children who had somehow decided he was their father. I'll keep them, he promised. All of them. Vera watched this scene with an expression Ryan was beginning to understand, the look of someone whose carefully constructed armor was developing cracks, and who wasn't entirely sure if that was disaster or relief. We leave tonight, she said, before they return with reinforcements. Agreed. Ryan stood, his mind already cataloging what he'd need to pack, what he could abandon, how to book passage without attracting attention. I'll handle the travel arrangements. There's a freighter captain who owes me a favor. Why does a human isolated on a forgotten station have favors owed by freighter captains? Ryan smiled. Same reason a Kethvori mother knows how to disappear completely for 3 years. We all have our skills. They worked through the night, packing in silence broken only by the children's occasional questions and observations. The smallest one, the girl, appointed herself Ryan's assistant, carefully placing his belongings in containers with a seriousness that made his chest ache. She arranged his few possessions in geometric patterns that reminded him of how he'd laid out those first carrots. Some things, he realized, transcended species. As dawn cycle approached, Ryan made one final pass through his pod, checking for anything they'd missed. His eyes fell on the shelf where he'd displayed the Kethvori metalwork, 7 pieces of intricate beauty that represented 7 acts of connection across an impossible divide. He packed them last, wrapping each one carefully. The freighter departed Zirian Station 3 hours later, its manifest listing 5 passengers traveling under false names to a destination the captain had been paid handsomely to forget. In a cargo bay that had been converted to temporary living quarters, 3 Kethvori children discovered the wonders of fresh apples, while their mother and a human who'd once been a whistleblower discussed the practical details of starting over. The colony will ask questions, Vera said, watching her children with an expression that might have been contentment. Let them ask. Ryan offered her one of the apples. We'll tell them we're a family. You understand this changes everything, that you cannot return to your isolation, that you will be responsible for beings who are not your species, not your blood. Ryan thought about the empty years on Zirion Station, about the careful distance he'd maintained from everything and everyone, about the slow death of living without purpose. He thought about a child's laugh heard through a ventilation grate, about geometric patterns made from vegetables, about small hands that had reached for him without fear. Good, he said. Everything needed to change. The oldest child approached with another piece of metalwork, newly made from scraps he'd found in the cargo bay. He pressed it into Ryan's hand with both of his own, speaking in Kethvori, and then translating carefully into Standard. For the Father who chose us. Ryan accepted the gift, feeling its warmth settle into his palm like a small star. Through the porthole, Zirion Station receded into the distance, taking with it 2 years of careful isolation and all the reasons he'd thought he needed to stay alone. Ahead, somewhere in the unmapped dark, a failed colony waited. A place where questions wouldn't matter as much as actions, where the strange family assembled in this cargo bay might find something resembling peace. Vera's hand brushed his shoulder, a Kethvori gesture of deep trust, her first voluntary touch. Thank you, she said simply. Ryan looked at the 3 children who had decided he was their father, at the woman who had trusted him enough to let him become one, at the life he'd somehow been given despite never asking for it. "We're going to be okay," he said, and for the first time in years, he believed it. The metalwork in his hand caught the light as the ship jumped to hyperspace, its impossible patterns revealing depths that shifted with every angle, every moment, every choice that led to this one. Some connections, Ryan thought, couldn't be planned or predicted. They simply happened. Small kindnesses stacking into something that resembled family. Geometric patterns of vegetables transforming into the architecture of belonging. The smallest child fell asleep against his leg, her breathing steady and trusting. Outside, the stars stretched into lines of light. Inside, a human and four Kethvori traveled toward a future none of them could have imagined, held together by nothing more than carrots and courage and the revolutionary idea that family was something you built rather than something you were born into.